She defended a homeless man ordering 2 eggs in a greasy cafe. She had no idea he could buy the entire city. But when a millionaire tried to humiliate him, what she did next changed both their lives forever. What you're about to hear is a story that will make you cry, make you angry, and make you believe in humanity again. This isn't just about a billionaire in disguise. This is about the moment when true character is finally rewarded. And I promise you, you won't see the ending coming. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll never look at another person the same way again. Welcome to Voice of Granny. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. Let me tell you a story that'll change the way you see people. It's about a man who had everything money could buy, but nothing that really mattered. And it's about a woman who had almost nothing, but possessed something priceless. Picture this: London, one of the richest cities in the world. In a glass tower overlooking the Thames, there lived a man named Richard Ashford. Now, Richard wasn't just wealthy. He owned a technology empire worth £70 billion. 70 billion. That's a number so big, most of us can't even imagine it. But here's the thing about Richard. He lived in his tower, made his deals, moved his money around, and never once thought about the real people affected by his decisions. To him, everything was just numbers on a screen. Profit margins, stock prices, quarterly reports. His business partner, a man named Julian Cross, saw this. Julian was ambitious, hungry for power, and he knew Richard's weakness. One day, in their pristine boardroom high above the city, Julian threw down a challenge. "You're out of touch, Richard," Julian said, leaning back in his chair with a smug smile. "The newspapers are calling you the ghost of London. You make decisions that affect thousands of lives, but you've never walked a single day in their shoes." Richard bristled at this. He was used to being respected, even feared. Nobody talked to him like this. "What are you suggesting?" Richard asked coldly. Julian's eyes gleamed. "I'm suggesting a wager. 7 days. 1 week of your life. You live like them, the ordinary people whose lives you control. No bank account. No credit cards. No private drivers. We give you a room in a hostel, a cheap mobile phone, and £200 cash. That's it. Survive for 1 week." Richard's first instinct was to laugh. It was ridiculous. Childish. But then he saw the look on Julian's face, that certainty that Richard couldn't do it. That he was too soft, too pampered, too removed from reality. Pride is a powerful thing. "Fine," Richard said. 1 week. But when I return, Julian, you're personally overseeing that budget disaster in the South End project. Every detail. Every complaint. Julian's smile faltered, but he nodded. Deal. 3 days later, Richard Ashford disappeared. In his place was Rick, a middle-aged man in a second-hand jacket with a hole in the sleeve, worn jeans, and scuffed trainers. He hadn't shaved in days. He looked tired. He looked ordinary. And for the first time in 30 years, people looked right through him. The £200 was vanishing faster than he'd expected. The hostel cost £40 a night. Food was expensive. Transport added up. He'd been walking the streets of East London for 2 days, invisible, anonymous, and hungry. Truly hungry. On the third morning, with only £30 left and 4 days to go, Richard found himself standing outside a small cafe called Rosie's Kitchen. It wasn't much to look at, squeezed between a betting shop and a charity store, with steamy windows and a flickering neon sign that buzzed like a dying bee. But it smelled like coffee and fried eggs, and his stomach was cramping with hunger. He pushed open the door. A small bell chimed above his head. The cafe was real. It was lived in. The floor was cracked linoleum, patched in places with duct tape. The tables were mismatched, some wooden, some formica, all bearing the scars of years of use. A long counter stretched along one wall, where a few tired-looking men hunched over their mugs. Richard slid into a booth near the window. The vinyl seat was torn, yellow foam poking through. He could hear the sizzle of a grill, the clink of dishes, and a radio playing old pop songs. A moment later, she appeared. Her name tag said Elena. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her black hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. But her uniform was spotless, a pale blue dress with a white apron, and there was something in the way she carried herself. Dignity. That's the word. Despite everything, she had dignity. "Coffee?" she asked. Her voice was flat, professional, worn thin by too many shifts. "Please." "Black," Richard said quietly. She returned within seconds, placing a chipped mug in front of him and sliding a laminated menu across the table. She moved on to the next table without another word. Richard opened the menu and felt a jolt of something like shame. The prices were from another era. He searched for the cheapest thing that qualified as actual food. 2 eggs on toast. £3.50. When Elena returned, he pointed at the menu. Just the 2 eggs, please. And the coffee. He braced himself for judgment. For an eye roll. For contempt. He was taking up a whole booth for a £3.50 order. Elena simply wrote it down. Coming right up, she said in that same tired, professional tone. That was it. No judgment. No sneering. No pity. She'd treated him like a person. Like a customer who deserved basic respect, regardless of what he could afford. Richard wrapped his cold hands around the warm mug and felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt seen. Not as Richard Ashford, billionaire. Not as a powerful CEO. But as a human being. And in that moment, sitting in a rundown cafe in East London, wearing a jacket with a hole in the elbow, Richard Ashford began to wake up. He didn't know it yet, but this woman, this tired waitress who'd shown him simple kindness, was about to teach him the most important lesson of his life. Richard came back the next day. And the day after that. It wasn't part of the challenge. He could have gone anywhere. But something drew him back to Rosie's kitchen. Maybe it was the cheap food that stretched his dwindling cash. Maybe it was the warmth. Or maybe it was Elena. He always sat in the same booth, always ordered the same thing, black coffee, sometimes with dry toast. He became part of the furniture. Rick, the quiet man in the corner. Nobody paid him any attention, and for the first time in decades, Richard could simply watch. And what he saw changed everything. He saw Elena help old George, a shaky-handed regular, read the specials board. She didn't just read them out. She leaned in close and said, "The shepherd's pie is lovely today, George. Tony made it fresh this morning, not from yesterday's batch." He saw her handle a young mother whose toddler was having a complete meltdown, screaming and throwing crayons across the floor. Elena didn't scowl or complain. She walked over, knelt down to the child's level, and offered him a small cup with a cherry and a silly straw. "This is a superhero drink," she told the boy softly. The crying stopped instantly. The mother looked at Elena with tears of gratitude. Richard watched her move through the cafe like flowing water, efficient, graceful, never wasted motion. Clearing tables, refilling cups, taking orders, making conversation with the regulars. She remembered their names, their usual orders, their lives. But it was during the quiet afternoon hours that Richard learned the most. The cafe would empty out after the lunch rush, and Elena would work on other things. Richard saw her behind the counter with a massive textbook open. He squinted to read the spine, Advanced Business Management. This wasn't a community college workbook. This was university-level material. One afternoon, he saw her on the payphone near the toilets. Her back was rigid, her voice low and tense. He could only hear fragments of the conversation. "Mum, please don't argue. You have to take the medication. I don't care what the doctor said about the cost. Because we'll figure it out. I'll figure it out. Yes, I'm eating. I'm fine. My shifts are fine. Tony's giving me extra hours on Saturday." She hung up the phone and pressed her forehead against the wall. Her eyes were closed. Richard watched her take one long, shaking breath, composing herself. Then she smoothed her apron, lifted her head, and walked back onto the floor with that same professional mask. "More coffee, George?" The pieces fell into place. The exhaustion. The textbook. The desperate need for extra shifts. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a caregiver, a student, a provider. All wrapped in one tired young woman who probably hadn't had a full night's sleep in months. That evening, Richard was at the counter paying for his coffee when the owner, Tony, was talking to Elena as her shift ended. She'd changed into jeans and a hoodie, a heavy backpack over her shoulder. "Hold on, Elena," Tony said, his voice heavy. "Got some bad news." Richard pretended to look for change, but he was listening. "The bank turned us down," Tony said quietly. "The final appeal. They're calling in the loan. We've got 30 days to pay £50,000, or they take the cafe." Elena's face went white. 50,000? "Tony, that's impossible." "How?" "It's this whole block," Tony said, gesturing helplessly. "Property taxes have tripled. There's this big developer, Ashford Technologies, buying up everything. They're squeezing us out. The bank knows the land is worth more than the cafe. They'd rather we default, so they can sell to the developers." Richard's blood turned to ice. Ashford Technologies. His company. His urban development project. Julian's pet project. The cafe wasn't just failing. His own company was the one destroying it. Tony, we can't let them do this, Elena said, her voice shaking. This place is your whole life. It's my job. It's Tony Jr.'s job. It's where George eats every day. I know, love, Tony said, his voice cracking. But I don't know what to do. I've got nothing left. Elena stared at the floor. When she looked up, her eyes were hard with determination. Then we fight. We do a fundraiser. A Save Rosie's Kitchen night. We call the newspapers. A fundraiser for 50,000? Tony said. Elena, we'd be lucky to raise 5. Then 5,000 is better than nothing, she said fiercely. We have to try. She practically ran out of the cafe, the bell jingling violently behind her. Richard stood frozen by the counter, his 2 pounds for coffee forgotten in his hand. He had spent 3 days in this cafe. 3 days watching Elena show kindness to strangers, work herself to exhaustion, study for a better future, care for her mother, and defend this little corner of the world. And his company, his own company, was the villain in her story. The experiment, the stupid wager with Julian, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was that he'd finally seen what his decisions actually looked like on the ground. Not as numbers on a spreadsheet, but as real people with real lives. Richard left the cafe and walked 3 blocks in the cold rain. He turned a corner and saw a black Mercedes idling in the shadows. It had been following him the entire week, keeping him safe from a distance. He walked up and tapped on the window. His driver and bodyguard, James, stared in shock. Mr. Ashford? Richard opened the back door and climbed in. The smell of leather and expensive cologne was overwhelming after days in the hostel. Take me home, James, Richard said, and get Julian Cross on the phone. Now. The next morning, the sky over London was grey and heavy with rain. Inside Rosie's kitchen, the mood was even darker. There were no customers. Tony had locked the door. Inside, just 3 people sat in silence. Tony behind the counter, Elena at a table with her head in her hands, and Tony Jr. in the kitchen, not cooking, just sitting. They were waiting for the end. At exactly 11 o'clock, there was a sharp knock on the glass door. He's here, Tony whispered, his face pale. Elena stood up, her jaw set. Let him in. We'll face him with our heads up. Tony unlocked the door. The man who entered was everything Rosie's kitchen was not. He wore a suit that probably cost £3,000, carried a leather briefcase, and had the cold, polished look of someone who destroyed things for a living. Anthony Rossi? The man said, not offering his hand. That's me, Tony said. I'm Philip Hawthorne from Ashford Technologies' Urban Development Division. He placed a business card on the counter. I think you know why I'm here. Richard, watching from a shadowy corner booth, felt rage building in his chest. This was one of Julian's men. One of his employees. Doing this in his name. The bank loan, Tony said quietly. Correct, Hawthorne said, opening his briefcase. As of this morning, Ashford Technologies has purchased your debt. You now owe us directly, which simplifies things considerably. You bought our debt? Tony's voice shook. We did. Now you have 2 options. Hawthorne slid papers across the counter. Option 1. Pay the £50,000 plus our acquisition fees within 48 hours. Or option 2, which I strongly recommend, you sign this transfer of deed. We'll forgive the debt entirely and give you £5,000 for relocation expenses. You'll be out by the end of the month. 5,000. Tony whispered. This place is worth 10 times that. My equipment alone. Your equipment is ancient, Mr. Rossi. Your customer base is negligible. Your profit margins are non-existent. We're not buying your cafe. We're buying the land underneath it. The 5,000 is a courtesy. That's when Elena moved. She walked right up to Hawthorne, and Richard saw that same fire in her eyes that he'd seen when she defended him from the rude customer days ago. You can't do this, she said, her voice shaking but strong. This is Tony's life. This is where old George eats every single day. This is where the construction workers come for lunch they can actually afford. You're not just destroying a building. You're destroying a community. Hawthorne looked at her with open contempt. And you are. Her name is Elena, a voice said from the corner booth. Everyone turned. Richard stood up slowly. In his worn jacket and unshaven face, he looked like just another down-on-his-luck customer. Hawthorne raised an eyebrow. I beg your pardon? I said her name is Elena, Richard repeated, walking closer. And she asked you a question. How can you do this? Hawthorne laughed. Who are you? The local charity case? Sit down, old man. This is business. It's above your understanding. He's a customer, Elena said sharply, and he has every right to speak. This place is a relic, Hawthorne said, dismissing them both. This entire block is being demolished. We're building a new tech campus. It'll bring real jobs, not this. He waved his hand dismissively at the cafe. It's called progress. It's called cruelty, Elena shot back. You're treating human beings like they're nothing, like they're just obstacles in your way. That's a very sweet sentiment, Hawthorne said coldly, but it doesn't pay the bills. He turned back to Tony. You have 48 hours, Mr. Rossi. Sign the papers, take the 5,000, or we take it anyway and you get nothing. Choose wisely. Tony looked at the papers. His hands were shaking. He looked at Elena, at Tony Jr. in the kitchen, at old George's empty seat. Get out, Tony whispered. What? Hawthorne said. Get out of my cafe. Tony roared. He pushed the papers back across the counter. Get out. We're not signing. Not today. Not ever. Hawthorne stared, genuinely shocked. He'd expected a broken man. He slowly gathered his papers. Very well, he said, his voice ice. You've made a terrible mistake. Foreclosure begins immediately. You'll all be on the street by Monday. Enjoy your principals while you can. He turned and walked out. The bell above the door rang mockingly. The cafe fell silent. Tony slumped onto a stool and put his head in his hands. Elena stood frozen, her chest heaving. Tony Jr. came out of the kitchen, his face stricken. Richard stood in the middle of the cafe, watching them. These good people who'd done nothing wrong except exist in the way of his company's expansion. He had seen enough. More than enough. He walked to the door, and Elena looked up, her face streaked with tears. Rick, she said softly. Thank you for speaking up. You defended me first, Richard said quietly. You've been defending people since the moment I met you. You did it when you thought I was nothing. When you gained nothing from it. That's called character, Elena. He pushed open the door. Where will you go? She asked. Richard looked back at her. This tired, fierce, beautiful soul who'd reminded him what human decency looked like. I'm going to do something I should have done years ago, he said. I'm going to fix this. And he walked out into the rain. He didn't go back to the hostel. He walked straight to where James was waiting in the Mercedes. Mr. Ashford, James said, getting out quickly. Home, Richard said. And call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. Everyone. Especially Julian Cross. The next morning at Rosie's kitchen, Elena and Tony were there early, but not to serve customers. They were there to say goodbye. The 48-hour deadline was approaching. They had no money. No options. They were just trying to accept the inevitable. Elena was wiping down tables that didn't need wiping, her eyes red from crying. Tony was behind the counter, going through old receipts, as if the answer might be hidden in them somewhere. At 10:30 in the morning, there was a knock at the door. It's too early, Tony said, his voice hollow. We still have hours left. But Elena walked to the door and unlocked it anyway. Let's just get this over with. The door opened, but it wasn't Philip Hawthorne. It was a group of people. 4 of them. 3 men in dark, expensive suits, and 1 woman carrying a briefcase. And in front of them all stood a man who made Elena's breath catch in her throat. He was tall, imposing, dressed in a navy blue suit that looked like it cost more than her entire year's wages. His hair was perfectly styled, his jaw clean-shaven, and his eyes. Those eyes. She knew those eyes. Rick, she whispered. Good morning, Elena. Tony, the man said. His voice was the same, but different. Smoother. More powerful. It was the voice of someone used to commanding rooms full of powerful people. Tony stared, his mouth hanging open. Rick. What's happening? But Elena was looking at the man behind him. Philip Hawthorne stood there, and his face had gone completely white. He looked like he was about to be sick. Mr. Ashford, Hawthorne stammered. Sir, I had no idea you'd be. I didn't know. Mr. Ashford? Elena repeated, the words not making sense in her mouth. The man who'd been Rick, who'd sat quietly in the corner booth ordering 2 eggs and black coffee, who'd looked like any other struggling soul in London, took a step forward. Elena, Tony, I need to apologize, he said. My name is Richard Ashford. I'm the founder and CEO of Ashford Technologies. And I am deeply, truly sorry for what my company has done to you. The room spun. Elena grabbed the back of a chair for support. You're Richard Ashford? The Richard Ashford? Yes, he said simply. You were testing us? Her voice rose with anger and betrayal. This was all some kind of sick game? No, Richard said firmly. I was testing myself. I'd been told I was out of touch, disconnected from the real world. So I came to see it for myself. I didn't expect to find this place. I didn't expect to find you. He looked at her, and his eyes were full of something Elena had never seen in a powerful man's face before. Genuine respect. Your kindness to a man you thought was homeless, he continued. Your defense of me against that rude customer. Your character when you had every reason to be bitter and cruel. Elena, you reminded me what real value looks like. And it's not in a bank account. He turned to Hawthorne, and his voice went cold. Mr. Hawthorne, you told Tony this cafe was a relic that needed to die. You dismissed Elena. You represented my company with the kind of cruelty I find absolutely unacceptable. Sir, I was just following Mr. Cross's directive. Julian Cross's directives are not my values, Richard said. You're fired, Philip. Security will escort you out. Your severance will be minimal. Now give your briefcase to Margaret. The woman stepped forward and took the briefcase from Hawthorne's shaking hands. Escort him out, Richard said to the two men in suits. They took Hawthorne by the arms and walked him out. He was mumbling, pleading, but Richard had already turned away from him. He walked to the counter where the foreclosure papers sat. He took a pen from his jacket and in one bold stroke, wrote void across the front page. He signed his name below it, R. Ashford. This is over, he said, sliding the paper to Tony. The debt is cancelled. Rosie's kitchen is yours, free and clear. Forever. Tony picked up the paper with trembling hands. He looked at it, looked at Richard, and then he collapsed onto a stool and began to weep openly. Elena just stood there, her mind trying to catch up with reality. I don't understand. Why? Because you're right, Richard said. This isn't just a building. It's a home. It's old George's breakfast. It's where the construction workers can afford to eat. It's where you're studying to build a better life for yourself and your mother. It's real. And I nearly destroyed it without ever seeing it. The door burst open again, and a man stormed in, looking furious. Richard, what the hell is going on? James called me. You can't just fire Hawthorne. That foreclosure is critical to the South End development. It was Julian Cross, Richard's business partner. The wager is off, Julian, Richard said calmly. What? But you completed the week. I said it's off because I won, Richard replied. I learned exactly what I needed to learn. And as for the South End development, it's cancelled. Effective immediately. Cancelled? Julian shouted. That's a £100 million project. The board will never allow. The board answers to me, Julian. And I'm not in the business of destroying communities anymore. I'm in the business of building them up. He turned back to Elena. Which brings me to why I'm really here. Elena could barely breathe. I don't understand. I saw you studying, Richard said gently. Business management. I saw you calculating numbers in your head when Tony mentioned the fundraiser. You're brilliant, Elena. And you have something my entire company lacks, a moral compass. He took a step closer. I'm creating a new division at Ashford Technologies. It's going to be called the Community First Initiative. Its entire purpose will be to find small businesses like this one, places being crushed by predatory lending or corporate greed, and save them. We'll provide funding, legal support, business advice. We won't buy them. We'll invest in them. Elena's hands were shaking. I want you to run it, Richard said. I want you to be the director. You'll have a full salary, benefits, and we'll pay for the rest of your degree. And, he paused, his voice softening, I overheard your phone call about your mother. Her medical care is covered. All of it. Consider it done. Tears were streaming down Elena's face. Not tears of sadness this time, but of overwhelming relief and disbelief. This isn't charity, Richard added quickly. It's an investment in the best hire I've ever made. You've earned this, Elena. Yes, she whispered. Yes. Of course, yes. Richard smiled, a real, genuine smile. Welcome to Ashford Technologies, Director. 6 months later, London was still London. The traffic still snarled. The rain still fell. But in a small corner of East London, everything had changed. Rosie's kitchen gleamed. It had new floors, new tables, a new sign that didn't flicker. But the heart of it remained the same. Tony was still behind the counter. Tony Jr. was still in the kitchen. And old George still sat in his favorite spot every morning. The bell above the door chimed, and Richard Ashford walked in. He wasn't wearing a suit today, just a casual sweater and jeans. He looked relaxed. He looked happy. Afternoon, Richard. Tony called out with a genuine smile. Tony, Richard nodded. He slid into his old booth by the window. A moment later, Elena approached. She was dressed in smart business clothes, carrying a tablet, her hair styled professionally. She looked transformed, rested, confident, vibrant. But that fire in her eyes, that core of steel, was still there. "You're late for our meeting," she said with a playful smile. "I know," Richard admitted. "I got caught up reviewing the numbers on the new projects. Your team saved 3 more businesses this month. 3 families who get to keep their livelihoods." Elena sat down across from him and opened her tablet. "Actually, it's 4. We just finalized the deal on that bookshop in Camden." The owner cried when we told her. "You're good at this," Richard observed. "I care about it," Elena corrected. "That's the difference." They worked for a while in comfortable silence, reviewing projects, discussing strategies, planning the next quarter. The Community First initiative had become one of Ashford Technology's most successful divisions, not in terms of profit, but in terms of impact. And Richard had learned that impact mattered more than he'd ever imagined. Finally, Elena looked up from her tablet. "My mom wants to thank you, by the way. The new treatment is working. The doctors are hopeful." "I'm glad," Richard said sincerely. "How are your classes going?" "I'm graduating in 2 months," Elena said, and her smile was brighter than the sun. "Top of my class." "I never doubted it." There was a pause. Elena looked around the cafe, at old George carefully eating his shepherd's pie, at the construction workers laughing over their lunch, at Tony wiping down the counter with pride. "You know," Elena said quietly, "I think about that day sometimes. When you walked in here looking lost and hungry. When I poured you that first cup of coffee." "So do I," Richard said. "Did you know then?" she asked. "Did you know you were going to change everything?" Richard shook his head. "No. I thought I was going to learn some lesson about humility and then go back to my tower. But you taught me something much more important." "What's that?" "That dignity isn't about how much money you have," Richard said. "It's about how you treat people who can't do anything for you. You defended me when you thought I was nobody. You stood up to that developer when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. You showed me that character isn't who you are when someone's watching. It's who you are when you think no one important is looking." Elena's eyes glistened. "You were important, though. Every person who walks through that door is important." "I know that now," Richard said. "Thanks to you." Tony came over with a coffee pot and refilled their cups without being asked. "You two working hard or hardly working," he joked. "Bit of both," Elena laughed. Tony looked at Richard. "You know, when you first started coming in here, I thought you were just another bloke down on his luck. Never imagined you'd end up saving this place. Saving us." "You saved me first," Richard said simply. "All of you. You reminded me why any of this matters." After Tony left, Elena and Richard sat quietly for a moment. Outside the window, London rushed past, people hurrying to their jobs, their lives, their struggles and triumphs. But inside Rosie's kitchen, time seemed to slow down. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said. "Anything. Do you ever regret it? Walking away from that old life? Julian's gone. Half your board was furious. You completely redirected the company's focus. Do you ever wish you'd just stayed in your tower?" Richard thought about it. He thought about his old office, 90 floors above the city. He thought about the isolation, the sterile meetings, the endless pursuit of numbers that meant nothing. "Not for a single second," he said. "I was living Elena, but I wasn't alive. I had everything and nothing at the same time. This," he gestured around the cafe at her, at the life they'd built. "This is real. This matters." Elena smiled. "So what do you have today, then?" Richard looked at her, at this remarkable woman who'd changed his life simply by being decent when she didn't have to be. He thought about all the fancy restaurants he could afford, all the exclusive clubs, all the 5-star experiences money could buy. "You know what?" he said. "I'll have 2 eggs, sunny side up, and a black coffee." Elena laughed, a real, genuine, joyful laugh. "Coming right up." She stood and walked to the kitchen to place the order. Richard watched her go, feeling something he'd spent £60 billion and never found, contentment. The bell above the door chimed as new customers entered. Old George called out a greeting. Tony Jr. sang along to the radio in the kitchen. And somewhere in East London, in a little cafe that almost wasn't, life went beautifully, perfectly on. Because in the end, this story isn't really about a billionaire learning a lesson. It's about all of us. It's about remembering that every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. It's about choosing kindness when it costs you nothing and everything at the same time. It's about understanding that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts. It's measured in moments like these, in a warm cup of coffee, in a kind word, in standing up for someone who can't stand up for themselves. Elena taught Richard that. And maybe, just maybe, we can all learn it too. The eggs arrived, perfectly cooked, sunny side up. Richard picked up his fork and smiled. Some things, he thought, are worth more than all the money in the world. The end. Remember, character isn't who you are when everyone's watching. It's who you are when you think nobody's looking. Be the person who defends the stranger. Be the person who shows kindness without expecting anything in return. Be Elena. Be the change.